This is the Unregistered podcast, and I'm Thaddeus Russell. This is a show about ideas, people, and behaviors that are considered inappropriate, out of bounds, or beyond the pale. The things you're not supposed to talk about if you're a school teacher, a college professor, a businessman, a politician, a parent, a neighbor, or even a podcast host. These are the things you're not supposed to say or even think if you're a good liberal, a good conservative, or a good citizen. Each week, I'll interview a person who has something bad to say. They might be a journalist or a professor. They might be a porn star or a drug dealer. They might just be an ordinary person with an ordinary job who doesn't care about the rules of polite society. I'm not interested in breaking the rules just to be a troublemaker. I'm interested in people who break the rules of conventional thought and to expand the scope of what is possible to say in our society. I'm interested in people who make me think.
This is an episode of many surprises. First of all, many regular listeners may be surprised that Dar Williams, a leading figure in the folk pop women's music scene of the 1980s, 90s, and 2000s, is the guest on the show. She's definitely different than most people we've had. For one thing, she's the very first musical artist to appear on Unregistered. But in addition to being a singer-songwriter, Dar has always been known to be especially politically engaged as an artist. She has sung about, lectured about, spoken about, written about progressivism, environmentalism, and feminism. Three political movements with which I, in particular, have become increasingly dissatisfied. And so that's the other surprise, at least for me. Dar and I talked about the decentralization of urban life in America that's been going on over the last 20 to 30 years and the growth of small towns and cities as cultural hubs, something that progressives generally ignore. And this is the subject of Dar's new book, which is called What I Found in 1,000 Towns. But at a certain point in the conversation, I realized that what we were talking about was a deeper kind of freedom. Individual personal freedom, the kind of freedom that I think people on the left have ignored or actually looked down upon. That doesn't seem to be true with Dar Williams, though. She really surprised me when she talked about what feminism means to her. Surprised me and moved me deeply. I came away from our talk with a feeling I haven't had in quite a while, which was hope. Hope that I might someday find common cause again with people on the left. This is my interview with Dar Williams.
So as a lot of you know, I moved to Salem, Oregon 2 years ago, and I had, until then, lived my entire life in Berkeley, California, Manhattan, Park Slope, Brooklyn, and Los Angeles. And I had thought for my entire life until then that I needed to live in places like that to do anything in the worlds in which I wanted to operate, academia or media, have a career that involves creativity. I had to live in those places, not a place like that, those places. And that was part snobbishness and it was part practical reality because you simply really couldn't do those things in a major way, in a national scale, in any place other than New York or San Francisco or Los Angeles. And then, of course, what happened, as everybody knows, is that those places became impossible to live in unless you're a multimillionaire. And I realized that this was done. I had to leave. I had to move elsewhere. And so I ended up in Salem, Oregon. And I noticed something, though. I noticed that Salem is still a very gritty place with a bunch of problems. It's not the most beautiful town in the world, but things are happening and it's changing, and mostly I think for the better. You can ask locals. Some of them have different ideas about this, but I then noticed that other towns like Salem were going through similar transformations. I was in Lancaster, Pennsylvania recently, and I saw exactly the same thing, that it was very different than the depressed central Pennsylvania town that I had seen a long time ago. And this was last fall, I started thinking about this, and I thought, someone must be noticing this, because everyone's talking about, as far as I could tell, the death of the cities, and San Francisco and New York are no longer habitable for non-wealthy people. but there's something else going on that's being missed. And I just Googled it because I wanted to have an expert on this show to talk about it. And the name that came up immediately was Dar Williams, who, of course, I'd known about for decades as a singer-songwriter. But she had just at that moment published a book on this very topic. And she has expert knowledge because more than probably any urbanist working in academia, she has seen more towns like that than probably anyone else because she's traveled, touring, performing all over this country. So I am thrilled that she's here. And we're in Hudson Valley where she lives. And that's, of course, a very important part of the story. So Dar, thanks for doing this.
Thank you.
And I guess I wanted to just begin by sort of asking you, what is it about place that you care about? I've always cared about place too. When I have students in my classes, the first thing I ask them is where they're from. And I ask them extensively about the locality and really get into it. I've always been fascinated, and it seems like that's what I have in common with you. But most people don't, I think, care nearly as much as you and I do. Why do you care so much about locality? What's in a place or who's in a place?
A place helps you understand who you are, and you can tap it. You know, you can live in your head, and I like living in my head, but as what I've discovered from traveling, and other musicians have this too, you know, if you're courting inspiration to do what you do, if you're waiting for the window to open creatively, to see things poetically, there are certain places that will have a kind of a resonance, and certain places that don't. So selfishly, you know, I care about people caring about place because then they invest in that identity, and then I get to kind of feel that vibe when I show up in their town.
I already love what you're saying. Yeah, because that's not, it's so honest what you're saying. And most people just sort of impose their own morality or their own aesthetic sense on other people. They say, oh, well, this town should look like this, or people should live like that. Right. And I love that you're coming right out of the gate saying, well, it's really serving me. But I think that's great. And there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, I think that's the best way to go about making social change, as a matter of fact.
Oh, yeah. No, I agree with that. Selfish is good. I mean,
self-interest.
Caring about something.
Yeah.
First you care about something, and then you dig into the thing that you care about. And if you're not a sociopath, that's usually something kind of interesting to other people too.
Right. That's right.
So, you know, in my alma mater town, there's someone named Jen Alexander who started a Kid City. And she said all these professors were leaving for Santa Cruz and Portland and all the places that you're talking about. Mm-hmm. And she said, I wanted to make Middletown harder to leave. So she started this great museum called Kid City that has 100,000 visitors a year now. And she just built it out of her own self-interest and drawing people together, but fueled by that. And so, I'm no stranger to admiring self-interest, but you know, that place, that thing that happens when I come to a town and I see that town is proud, like that has this kind of what I call open-palmed welcome as opposed to clenched fist, where they haven't given in to this idea that franchises define them, that they have their own local businesses. It's a thing that you can feel. And it's a thing because I think it's something that they feel. And I am an advocate of living in a place that you feel as different from other places.
Why?
Because
I have my own reasons.
Right. No, I know. For me, seeing people get excited about it's kind of like a parallel to biophilia, you know? It's like they identify with this kind of deciduous tree and this kind of rock and this kind of, you know, river or lake. And then there's like the social contours of your history, you know, who like our town was a foundry.
Cold Spring.
Yeah. And there's this kind of layer of history and workers that came with it. And a lot of the names on the streets are the names of the people who still live there. And Pete Seeger lived 2 miles up the road from us, and that's kind of had its influence. The Hudson River's there, and there's all this history of the Hudson River in art and craft and military history. And that is something that you kind of can steep yourself in if you want. It's there for you, and it's, the ghosts of your town are there for you, and the culture of your town, and all of those things. And it's like the rocks and rivers. So when people say to me, oh, this is the place that John Bibb lived, he created Bibb lettuce in Frankfort, Kentucky, or when I drive through Kentucky and I see all of the horses and the history of, bourbon and the fact that the grass is so green, it's blue. It's like bluegrass, When I see people feeling that as their state, as opposed to how they feel northwestern Arkansas, I love how they allow themselves to be influenced by that specific place where they live. It gives them a fuller identity, I think, than if they just formed it within their homes, within a nuclear unit. And of course, I think that the interdependence of all of that, getting outdoors and being invested in where you live, also creates more stability and prosperity and new ways of looking at an American identity, as opposed to being sort of a generic stamp from an outside corporation, from a franchise corporation.
Yeah. So you began touring when, in the 80s?
Early 90s.
Early 90s. And so, well, I guess it wasn't quite as bad, but so I did a fair amount of traveling, not as much as you have done, but I've done a fair amount of traveling in places like the Midwest and the Great Plains, and in the 80s, though, when I was doing research for...
Oh, it was bad in the 90s.
It was horrific. Oh, yeah, certainly. But in the 80s, it was really... And that's when I totally despaired for America. And I would tell people, I would joke about how I'd never lived in America. And I would tell, people when I got back to the coast, I'd tell them, it's really bad out there. And all the cities look exactly the same. So you couldn't really tell Indianapolis from Cincinnati if you were standing in the downtown. And so I really saw no reason to live in those places. But I can only imagine being a touring musician in the United States in the 90s, or, really at any time, but certainly in the recent years. It must have been sort of devastating in some ways to see that, right? Especially back when you were starting.
Yeah.
But so they're on various levels. So one is you're alone, usually, right? On the road, in hotels or whatever it is, right? So there's that, and I want to get to that. That's the kind of the fundamental argument in your book. Actually, is about people. But right now, you're talking about things in places, right? Which is also important in your book, and it's important to me. So for one thing, like America just looks all the same, and a lot of it looks very much the same. It's just soul crushing to me, and maybe that's just snobbishness on our part, or my part, and I worry about that, but. There's no doubt that there is a tremendous amount of sameness. You do see the same chains in, pretty much every city now. And certainly in the 80s and 90s, it was even worse. But so there's a diversity, there's greater diversity of things to see, right? There's because there's a localism that's going on that's real, and it's profound, and it's widespread. So in not just Lancaster and Salem and these towns you're talking about, the title of your book is What I Found in 1,000 Towns. Right?
Yeah.
1,000, it's many hundreds for sure. You can see this everywhere. So you couldn't get decent coffee in the 1980s.
Right.
You just could not in most of this country. And now every town has just not a Starbucks, but most towns, I would say, right, probably have an independent cafe of some sort, right? Of that size.
There's a lot of them, yep.
Yeah. So just that alone. I know that might be dismissed as trivial, but first of all, you do a lot of traveling, it's not trivial. But I think it's not trivial in the sense that human beings are complex, right? Our minds are complex, our identities are complex, no matter what context we're living in. And so the America now looks, I think, more like a human being in a sense. There's just more complexity out there. Now, doesn't mean I value that. I just like seeing different things. Not everyone needs to value that, but I do, and it seems like you do. And that's one thing that's been going on, right? Over the last 20 or 30 years, especially, it's really profound. Yeah. And the food is so different now. Yeah. But again, it's like there's a lot. It's not just that you can get sort of gourmet food in Indianapolis now, which you can, and a great cup of coffee in Indianapolis, which you could not in the 1980s. It's also that there's just difference. There's localism. There's an interest in the place, which has its own paradoxes and potential traps, which I certainly want to talk about. But at least on that level, I just see reason to celebrate rather than just mourn the death of San Francisco and New York City, which is what most people are doing. And that's what I love about your book, is that you're saying, hey, wait a minute, guys, there's a whole lot of stuff going on out here.
Yeah.
That really is the present and probably the future. And it looks way better than we think.
Oh, yeah. I mean, what was happening in the early 90s, so that the mills, the mines, the factories, they're all shutting down, and some of them overnight, and in a line, so they can't. It's not like one's going okay, but this one goes down. It goes down at once in a region, and the malls came along, and then the next thing that was happening as I was starting was the internet commerce was starting to come up. So arguably, that should have been the final death knell.
That's what was said.
Right.
We're done. Malls and the internet will kill all of what we're talking about here. There will be no diversity.
Right.
No localities.
And get used to it.
Yep.
And it was, and I joke about this, I had friends who were like, I will never shop at a big box store. And I'm like, you don't have any money. Like you make your own clothes. I know who you are. Like you shop at the Goodwill, you grow your own food. You're not going to be the engine of a downtown. And so we're done. And I thought that my touring would be like outposts, super hippie colleges.
Right.
I mean, the first time I was seeing all of this happening, I played in Yellow Springs, Ohio.
That's where I went to college.
Oh, fantastic.
I went to Antioch.
Okay, so and I was on my way to.
When did you play there? Well, no, we're the same age. So,
1994.
yeah, we're the same age.
So that was
great town, right?
Fantastic, right?
Love Yellow Springs.
So, and everything that you want. And I went to the park, and there's the Yellow Springs, there's the rocks that are all
Glen Helen.
Yeah. Yep. So I felt it. They loved it. I loved it. They felt it. And then I was going to another Antioch in Indiana.
Let's see. Probably, I'm guessing which college.
It's like it's.
Yeah, I know it. I think. Yeah. Anyway, I know what you're talking about.
So there I was, but between the two,
they're like oases, right?
And you don't want to live in a country of oases where, when I was first starting to write this book, people are like, "Oh, Dar, you're just writing about liberal towns and they're college towns," and I'm like, "Okay, a lot of college towns suck. First of all,
right? Like Middletown."
And
Wesleyan
Middletown's on its way up, but for certain reasons.
Yeah.
And that I'm very prescriptive about, but even that is not a thing. It is not a given. Liberal towns, conservative towns. I had a friend who was trying to sort of quantify and create indexes around what I was discovering, see if there was some statistics to support which towns had this feel, and he was so happy to tell me that they leaned right.
Really?
He was a friend. He was a Republican. He was like, "Guess what? They lean right."
They lean right, meaning that the city council is majority Republican.
I don't know. I think he was just
metric?
really.
Yeah.
He was.
Or he was trying to piss you off.
Yeah, I think. But it was. But I was fine with that because. But the thing that was depressing to me was this idea that you would have this, little string of 3 towns per state. Yep. That were okay. Right. And everything else. And one, what Richard Florida calls the superstar cities. And he defines as kind of a spikiness in cities. Like everybody wants to be in these cities. And then everything else is just everything else. And these horrible expressions like flyover states. A flyover state? Like what? So there are states that have more space to experiment with ideas and to try new things, to the point where there's a main delegation of farmers and growers that were heading over to Iowa because Iowa is really trying new things with sustainability. Sometimes when you have the space and the privacy, Florida, everyone thinks of Florida as guns and snakes or, some of those stereotypes. It's a hotbed of innovation.
Gainesville is one of the towns you write about.
Yeah, and it is fantastic. And when I did a concert there,
it's hard to believe
the book,
but I believe you after reading your book. Yeah.
So,
it's also a college town, though, so it does have that advantage.
But it could have been. It could have been a crappy college town. It could have been, the kids ride around little pastel scooters. There's tons of, Greek life that can be incredibly exclusive and also, inclusive on the campus. there's a huge football culture. You know, you could point to all those things and say, oh, this is going to be what they call a T-shirt and $2 beer town.
Like Tuscaloosa, right? It's like that.
Is
right.
it? I don't, you know, but there are towns that, you know, where basically the town bows down to the college and just sells its T-shirts and slinks away. And Gainesville is the opposite. You have a really great engaged population, and then you've got a lot of great stuff on the college. Where the magic happens is these worlds coming together. And they do have a park that's full of alligators, so the Florida is in place. But anyway, there's these places where you have a little bit more freedom and space, and no one's looking. And Gainesville has the second highest number of medical patents out there right now. And there are things that are happening that are the models for things out in the world. You don't have the space and time. I mean, when my friends were all dancers and actors in New York City, they would have to rent a space for $20 an hour at least to practice. They didn't have, you know, the back room of a cafe to work with. So I'm an advocate of looking at all of the spaces. And I love when people say, you know, when my taxi driver in Alaska says, my girlfriend just caught a 50-pound salmon. And, you know, and then I get into a cab in Maine and they say, my girlfriend just caught a 50-pound lobster. You know, it's like, I like the differences. I like that there's alligators and you can't own a small dog in northern Florida. You know, that sense and that pride that people can dig into is what gives so much joy, you know, like flavor, but also like joy to the people who live there that you're just not going to get in a place that's just rich, just affluent, just has its public transportation together.
Sure.
So, I watch these places come up, and my big thing is people wanted to. Like, why did the downtowns come back? Some of it was urban planning, and you probably know more about this than I do. There's a real anti-sprawl, anti-car culture. Let's relook at this thing that happened in the 50s. Let's return to when urban planners were sociologists, historians, and cultural figures, which is what they used to be, according to Jeff Speck. And now, in the 50s, it was given to sort of post-World War II strategic thinkers,
right,
who looked in grids and cars and circulation, and now we're coming back to the organic, the organism of neighborhoods and thriving downtown centers.
Right. Yeah, the urban planners historically have a pretty horrible record in this country. So, I mean, immediately you should think of, or one should think of Robert Moses.
Right.
You know, if you've read that massive book on him.
I did not.
Or if you've read 10 pages of it, you'll know that he basically drove a bulldozer right through New York City and destroyed much of that city and dismembered much of it and made much of it just miserable. It's tragic because I lived in New York City for 17 years and you could feel it. I mean, the freeways that he ran through right through the city and cut off neighborhoods from major transportation routes, which makes them impoverished or keeps them impoverished, on and on and on, building these massive, ugly government buildings and structures. And it's a horrific record, but that goes for a lot of these cities, you know? And so there was very heavy, as you were talking about, very heavy intrusion by state government and local government too in that period, especially after World War II. Urban renewal, you know, slum clearance, it was
everything about it. That the tower, what was that? The tower in the park or something like that. Basically, you put all of the. I mean, I bet it was a real dream machine of Republicans and Democrats. Democrats saying we want to do something for, you know, disenfranchised people, so we'll create government housing. And yet it was off to the side. There's no cars, you know, there's no getting any place there. It's right. Isolated. There's no opportunity to link with the rest of the city or town. And it was that I do know about.
Yeah. It was mostly Democrats doing this stuff. You know, Moses, of course, was a New Dealer, Democrat. The urban renewal slum clearance stuff was almost entirely Democrats. That was mostly done for World War II purposes. So they would just wipe out an entire slum, you know, a poor neighborhood like Brownsville, Brooklyn, for instance.
And make a new deal.
And then they would just level it. Yes. And then they'd build all this new housing there, which was relatively cheaper, but they would build it in places that were near like the the Navy depot or some military installation so that the workers for the war could walk to work. So it was in the service of this bigger thing and ended up, but
Right.
so there's the politics of that, which is a separate thing we can talk about. But like it just ended up, it left us with basically war housing, military, basically for military purposes.
And the new planners are having a completely new conversation.
I was going to say, so am I right? I mean, you mentioned her in your book. It seems like you're influenced by Jane Jacobs.
Yes.
Right. And so Jane Jacobs, to me, and a lot of people, could be wrong about this, but she's sort of the anti-planner in a way, right? She's saying that let these people just do what they want to do, find their own way, interact on their own terms locally, and, we'll see 1,000 flowers bloom. She was the anti-Robert Moses almost specifically and directly,
they
right?
Did, right.
Yeah. So, and that's another thing that I immediately kind of picked up on. I liked in your book, that vibe, that influence, that interest.
I am going to confess something. I was a year or two into developing this. I was sort of making a large article about it as to sort of shop out as to maybe get a book contract. And I kept on expanding, coming up with my little categories of what really helps places thrive. And I came across Jane Jacobs' obituary.
Yeah.
I love obituaries. And I was like, oh, who is this?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I didn't know. I mean, she's like been haunting me. I mean,
Exactly.
It was how she talked about letting neighborhoods identify be who they are and identify who they are. The talking on the sidewalk and the stoop and all of these examples, having parks that are not, she said, what is this about the lungs of the city? That's ridiculous. She said, don't have giant parks.
Right.
Have small parks that are lined with businesses, homes, schools that keep them busy at different hours of the day. And I kept on just nodding my head and saying, oh, she totally agrees with me.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because I saw it. And now I get along with these new planners and sociologists. I thought they were going to say, like, who are you to write this book? But they were so thrilled because I'm the person who went out and said, you're right. I went out and saw what it looked like in the early 90s. I see what it looks like now. I see what has brought them back. And you were right to be critical of this element of Robert Moses and this element of what was going on in the 50s. And your attempts to help rein us back into pedestrian places, functioning transportation, localism, supporting local businesses in certain ways. Even Jane Jacobs, she talked about not mowing things down, having an old building next to a new building. This wealthier person's going to be in this wealthier thing. The people who run the sort of crappy nonprofit that threadbare running on a dime are going to hang out in the old building and let the dust fall on their shoulders. You want that mix of buildings because then you'll get the mix of people. So the new planners are respecting that variability. And I went out there and said, you're totally right.
Yeah. Yeah, you had done about 20 years of field work.
Exactly. I was their little field worker.
Exactly. Yeah,
and they were thrilled because they knew they were right.
So who are you talking about in terms of who are the urban planners you've talked? I mean, you mentioned Richard Florida. He's famous in this field, but a lot of listeners won't know this field at all. So you're definitely more of an expert than most people on this.
Well, there's the ones that I've spoken to are Richard Florida and Jeff Speck. And then there are these planners who come. This guy was an architect that I saw recently who he was like dancing from foot to foot. In Nashville. He was so excited and he said, I'm working on
just now.
Yeah,
you were just there. Yeah.
He said, I work on projects up in eastern Iowa, and I really feel like we could do this, we could harness this, but and we have this waterfront. And I said, oh, a waterfront's a great thing to, the way that you develop it, public-private partnerships. And, and he was literally just unstoppable physically in his vision of how he was going to take social capital with his design and sort of bring them together. He was going to harness social capital and he was going to create spaces and places that allowed other people to harness it. And, so it's just a lot of new people that I run into. It turns out a lot of urban planners are folkies.
Oh, yeah?
Well, yeah. So there's a lot of people who show up. Like this one woman came, she goes, ugh. She was with her friend. She goes, I'm an urban planner and I'm a really infrastructure-based urban planner, but it's about people. It's about people. Damn it. and I said, it's about infrastructure and people but it's chicken and egg. People talking about, we care enough about this town to care about its sewer system. Mm-hmm. And then you have a good sewer system, which creates a certain kind of pride. Like there's this interactive thing. But people have said, do you want to speak to the people who have created these sort of more recent planned communities like Seaside in Florida? So, and some of them are working on sort of next generation versions of these sort of planned cities that were more planned neighborhoods. And they're all saying, we're learning a lot more from them than from the sprawl culture and the car culture of the 50s. So it's more sort of the secondary, this next generation group that's talking to me about what they've been writing about, and I'm seeing it, and they're saying that's what we have been writing towards.
Yeah, it's so interesting that a lot of them are folk music aficionados. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, well, folk generally, if you're going to go to a folk concert instead of a headbanging concert, you're there to remember something. You're there to place yourself. Mm-hmm. As opposed to forget yourself, mm-hmm. and to locate yourself,
right,
and to introduce your kids to the experience of locating yourself. So when John Prine comes, I quoted him in the book, the song Sam Stone, there's a hole in Daddy's arm where all the money goes. You want to be a parent showing your kid that these things resonate with you, and that other adults are thinking about this, and that these are large concepts that we want to reach our tendrils into, not just understand, but really deeply, poetically understand. Urban planners have very similar mm-hmm. minds to that.
Yeah, your song Anthem, right? One of your early songs.
Oh my goodness, yeah.
That's a localist
song,
right?
Right.
I mean, that's way back.
I
right?
barely remember that.
Yeah, that's one of was that your first album or something?
Yeah. No, cassette. It never made its way to it.
Oh wow.
Yeah.
Right. Isn't it? It's very political too.
Mm-hmm,
and even
mm-hmm.
sort of, it's about international politics and national politics, but it's also about your town,
right.
isn't it?
Right.
Am I right? Yeah. Okay. So, and it's about your town. You're not making judgments or making assumptions about other people's towns. You're not speaking on behalf of other people in other towns, which is mm-hmm. something I really despise. And I don't see that in your book, and I don't see that in your thinking, which I really, really appreciate.
No, it's it's like a love letter. I mean, so I admire these towns. But
your song that you don't remember.
I clearly don't.
It is, the other thing I really like about it is that and this about your book too, is that it's not a love letter. It's not a hate letter. It's both simultaneously.
Well, it's definitely, I have my feelings, but it's an interesting conversation. The best thing that happens, I'll have a Q&A afterwards, and the best thing that happens is when people just start to talk to each other. Like I'm sort of ancillary, yeah. and they say, we're doing this and we're doing this, and what I will do is I'll say, well, from what I've seen, when you do that thing where you start a poetry series on your waterfront, that'll lead to a music series, and a music series will lead to people, talking about larger projects that they can do. And it's always going to get back to the schools, and it's always going to get back to the center of the town. So I like that you started that poetry thing. Mm-hmm. I think that's a great way to plant seeds. So ideally, though, people will just look at each other and point to each other and be like, wow, we've really done something very cool here. Gainesville was really, it got really animated in that way of people. And then they sort of looked at me and at each other and said, but how do we link that to a larger picture? We're just one mosaic tile. So how do we connect it to the next? But, mosaic tiles can be very inspiring. And so the next town over can, from my I've never had a Christmas letter. My parents did, but what I'm going to do next year is do a letter about my town, not about my kids and their prizes or whatever. Those are so intimidating. It would be about my town. Like 6 people got geothermal. We got involved with a solar project. We started doing movies over at the VFW hall, and that's been really awesome. We, so that people can see how much you can do when you live in a town or city.
Yeah.
So I'm very interested in teasing that out of conversations when I go to places.
Right. So there are many criticisms that are waiting for you, right? That you've probably dealt with about this thesis. Most of them I don't have, but I think we should talk about them.
Yeah.
Right. And so I'm sure that a lot of people listening already have many ideas about the problems here with your thesis and what you're saying generally. So one, I think, that would come to mind is that you are describing, generally speaking, cultures that, well, let me back up. So I'm from the Bay Area. We're the same age. I'm from the Bay Area. You're from Chappaqua? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. So, these are very particular places with very particular cultures.
Chappaqua is a very wealthy town.
Yeah. And Berkeley and San Francisco, not quite as wealthy, but basically similar cultures. And we're that's kind of the culture we love. And we started there, and we want America to look more like our towns. And one could say that the towns you write about in your book that you admire so much, what they've done over the last 20 or 30 years has begun to look more like, maybe not Chappaqua, but certainly more like Berkeley, right? And towns like that. So now you're not describing, I don't think ever in the book, sort of external coercion, sort of big government coming in or big corporations coming in and saying and imposing these cultures, right? So it's not that kind of imperialism, but nonetheless, one could say, I think, this is not my criticism, but I can imagine someone saying, oh, well, Dar Williams, you just want the world to look like your town.
Right. Okay. Well, there's a few ways, and actually I just heard a thing where Spike Lee was calling gentrification neocolonialism.
Yeah.
So it's important to get in. I was watching what you were watching. I was watching towns going from drug deals on every corner, plywood on every storefront, going to what we have now. So there are a few things to look at. First of all, my ideal in terms of what I feel when I go to a place, and also what I see people experiencing as a positive thing, is towns that are themselves, that have some. There's a different kind of architecture going on in Cleveland, Milwaukee, Cedar Rapids, this kind of Midwest grandeur, these banks that have a lot of gold leaf in them, this faith that they had in commerce. And there's this incredibly solid thing. Like ideally you're moving into something that is an expression of what's been there before, in terms of the architecture or the nature of your oak trees versus the pine trees in Maine. So ideally, there's something a little bit more biomorphic than just like we became this cutesy town. However, and I would call that improving your town. You improve the town so that people can walk and meet each other and have things going on. There are a few things going on with this. One is that it gets really cute. I was just in Santa Fe, and there was this guy in a serape, and he was like...
one of the cutest towns in the country, right?
It's adorable.
Cute in quotes.
And
yeah.
But, I love Santa Fe, and it's got a lot of really hardworking, cool people, sometimes on the inside, sometimes on the outskirts. It's Santa Fe is not just for the tourists, but I was walking past this store, and this guy in a little serape with like beautiful skin, young man, he was inviting me into the cruelty-free, animal-free soaps, and the soaps were shaped like cupcakes and there was like a soap bundt cake, and they would cut slabs off of, and it was very pastel. It was the store to make fun of. And this kid had this completely earnest, love of this soap. And I had a lightning bolt, which is that the big boxes, Amazon, all of these commercial places allowed us to buy our stuff, our main stuff. I could buy a box of aspirin that'll last me for 5 years. Yeah.
Right.
So I don't go to my downtown for normal stuff. I don't buy a hammer on Main Street anymore. I don't buy a snow shovel. And, I go to a Home Depot for that, or I go to, and I'm a pretty educated shopper, but, that's because there's no shovel in my town. It's this terrible, again, it's a chicken and egg thing. So who's going to bring the pulse back to a downtown? An eating establishment and a store for people who have disposable income to buy the cute stuff and the artisan stuff that's of, if I'm from New Hampshire and I make a birch bark canoe candle, which is different from the thing that's shaped like a cactus in Arizona, and I'm traveling, I'm going to get the birch bark here. And, so that cutesy thing for that traveling person or the person who's coming specifically to get gifts and cute stuff, that's what's going to sell, because your shovel, you don't get there. There's this thing that I call the VR ratio, the visitor resident ratio. And in Moab, there's still this really big, ordinary drugstore that sells shovels and socks and aspirin. And there are towns that don't have it at all. And then you're not going to get old people who don't like to drive. You're not going to have the pedestrian. You're not going to have little children who can walk around and do stuff. You're going to miss out if you don't have some resident relevant. I call it resident relevant, visitor viable. You need visitor viable stuff to keep your downtown alive. At all. Any pulse is going to have to come from what we call the hipsters, And without them, there's nothing. It's what you and I saw in the mid-90s.
Yeah.
So to call that neocolonialism, to call that, it's the alternative to nothing. And that's a big problem. So how do we bring resident relevant ethos into these stores and ask stores to help shoulder the burden of affordable coffee, ordinary stuff, an aspirin, socks, a white T-shirt for those endless days when you find out 24 hours in advance that your kid's going to have to tie-dye, you know?
Yeah. First of all, I love that the economic theories, I'd never thought of this before, about how the big box stores, the big chains with the international trade, bringing in products from China, et cetera, have actually enabled, in a sense, is what you're saying, people to invest locally in the downtowns, I guess, in a way. We can, or maybe you weren't arguing that? It was the opposite? It's because in other words,
existence means that we don't buy down in a pedestrian downtown.
Okay. I was thinking that because they offer cheaper goods, and this is another potential criticism of what you're saying, right? Is that the hipster places, the local places, tend to be more expensive than Walmart, right? And so I was thinking that Walmart literally puts more money in the pockets of ordinary working class and poor people, who can then either invest in their own business locally or shop in the downtown hipster stores. No,
I mean maybe, but no, I'm sure there's an economic reality to that. But my experience is that people who are struggling to get by, they'll go to Walmart and they're not going to buy a birch bark candle. They're not going to. Okay. Yeah. My experience, but my experience is also that those people are, that the people who are at Walmart will also have a car. When I've been low income, in my experience, Chappaqua was actually kind of a one-horse town when I was growing up there, and that's, my father was born there, so it's we were on the other side of the tracks, as it were, and it was great, it was awesome, but and it got very fast in the 80s and got very wealthy, and it's very wealthy now, and there was that was going on, but I had a car that would break down a lot, and being reliant on my car had a lot of anxiety attached to it in terms of my job. So yes, you lower income people, they get to go drive out to Walmart and they can do all this stuff, and that definitely saves them a lot of money, as does Amazon. And you can say that puts more money in their pocket, and maybe that allows them to go eat at the cafes and do that. That certainly could be a reality. The overall experience of having commerce based on your car exclusively, if you want any kind of fruit or vegetable, any kind of ordinary object, your kid's sick and you need to go get some medicine. Being reliant on your car can be I would say, if I were much older and didn't want to drive, if I were disabled and didn't want to drive, if I had a beater car that I couldn't, that kept on breaking down, if I'm under 16, ideally, a pedestrian downtown that just has a modicum of these things, even at a more expensive price because they don't get the price break, just having that there for them. I'm not saying don't have a big box store. It's just having a downtown that's going to have some of these means that you're going to have some of these fancier stores, because that's where people with whatever money in their pockets they have to use for that those stores are the ones that are going to define a downtown, the fancy schmancy.
Yeah.
That's the real estate that will keep the blood running through your main street.
Well, it doesn't even have to be a fancy hipster boutique. It can also just be what's we usually call a mom and pop store, locally owned by ordinary people. I mean, in other words, there's just more money. I mean, there are multiple effects of Walmart, right, and the international chains, and one of them we can get into. But in terms of for the consumer, there's no doubt that it's better for American consumers, right? As a consumer, now whether you lost your job to this or not is a different question. I
totally hear you.
Yeah. So I mean, it's just I think that it is putting more money into places like Salem, Oregon, and Middletown, Connecticut, and so maybe who knows? I don't know, but I'm just wondering if that's partly enabling what we're talking about here. This renewal of these towns.
Sure. It could certainly be. But it's what's interesting to me is that when I was traveling around in the mid-90s, as were you, those towns weren't there at all. There was nothing. Right. There was nothing cute. There was no boutique.
They were hollowed out.
There was an economy, but it was a shadowy economy, and that was everywhere. And there was a depression. There was literally a the collapse. An emotional quality to it. Right. Yeah. And the big box stores at the time were basically the last the nail in the coffin. In terms of if you had a mom and pop store and people could more easily buy stuff 3 miles out of town, of course they were going to go 3 miles out of town. So a lot of the mom and pops went down. If they're going to come back now, it's only because of the cafe culture and some of the things that we call annoying hipster stuff, because that's what gets the feet moving. That's what gets the pedestrian traffic going. Then you can have a mom and pop store, but even then you're really swimming upstream. A local grocery is going to never have anything close to the price points of a large grocery store. So in order to, I would say, somebody said something in Beacon that was smart. She said, what about a general store, but for the 21st century?
Right.
So I'm writing a blog right now about what that would look like.
That's what I meant. So you can't, the mom and pop grocery store can't compete.
I don't think it can.
No, of course not. I meant that, and I've seen this, you've seen this, I'm sure, local people, ordinary people, not hipsters, not gentrifiers.
Right.
Who have established some small, not terribly fancy business that caters to locals and tourists. Or one or the other, right? And that's what I meant. That has its own niche within that economy.
If
the
you
local
can bring
economy.
It together, and that's what I see in my town too. People trying to kind of bring together both worlds. So that we have the incredible amount of tourists that we've been getting, and or visitors, I should say, and residents. Tourists, that conjures up a very specific stereotype. People like to visit other towns. They just like to feel them and see them, and walk through them and understand them, and that's a really kind of nice thing. So yes, my fantasy for towns is that somehow like there would be this little spontaneous conversation where people say, let's make sure we're always selling tube socks. And then we're always selling aspirin and always having, selling snow shovels and rock salt and things, and never just be selling, fancy furniture and candles that are shaped like our state bird.
Right.
Let's always keep some of that ordinary stuff in the mix, so that so that older citizens, lower income citizens who can't use their cars, if they have a headache, if they need some tube socks, that this is their town too.
Right.
That mix, I think, is magic.
Now, yeah, I agree. So let's see. First of all, for the hipsters, you just issued a pro-hipster manifesto almost, right? I mean, you're defending or saying, not just defending, you're saying this is where the action's going to be, guys. You're going to accept this. It's just a fact. And I agree with you. I completely agree with you. And that's my general attitude toward the so-called hipsters. I mean, Salem is an hour from Portland, which is the world capital of hipsters. And, every place in Portland seems like it's run by some guy with a beard who just developed some perfect artisanal coffee blend or something. But I say, because, people sneer at them and complain about it. And I say, what are you complaining about? It's like, they make great coffee. They make great food. And, some of it is like, my favorite place in Portland to eat, it's my son's favorite place too, is a place called Nong's, it's owned and operated by a Thai woman who moved to Portland and started selling a very simple chicken dish out of a cart. And then now it's like she has 4, I think, carts in a restaurant there. And it's like, it costs $8, $7 to have a meal. And is she a hipster? Is that a hipster thing? It's a hugely successful, popular place. So there's a whole mix.
It's a huge mix. And people sort of look and they go, oh, your main street has been gentrified. And because look at that wine bar, look at that brew pub. So, and look at that beard, look at that mustache. And one of the things that hit me, like, as I said, like a lightning bolt in Santa Fe, is that's the alternative to having nothing at all.
Yeah.
Because otherwise nothing will compete against a big box.
Yeah. I'm completely with you on this. I'm just thinking about, well, you know what I'm thinking about? I'm thinking about my friends in Salem all the friends I've made in Salem are old Salemites. They're not they've lived there their whole lives or most of their lives, right? And Salem was a complete, by our standards, dump. By most people's standards, just dump. It was like the armpit of Oregon, the armpit of the whole Northwest in some ways. Really ugly. And not much was going on there. I've had many friends complain. These people don't think the way we do. You and I think about this stuff. They don't like what's happening. It's the Portlandization of Salem.
What's the alternative for them? What would they rather see?
I'm with you. It's just an aesthetic choice, I guess. And I can't tell them they're wrong, and they can't really tell us we're wrong. It's just a question of which of us will impose our ideas or will on the other if we try to. I mean, we could be the groovy hipster Dar Williams, Thad Russell, Robert Moses of the 21st century, right? In which we could just do this all by policy, public policy, take over state government and just impose, all these rules about it. You have to sell certain things in your local stores that reflect the local history.
I see. Yeah.
You know what I mean? You're not calling for that, but that would be obviously problematic, as they say. And so that's another interesting thing about your book, because actually most books that address this, most people who address this issue do call for more or less, direct government intervention to ensure that, this is sold in this way and this zoning restricts this height of buildings and all that stuff to really shape a whole town or a city according to the interests and desires of the planner, right? And often, like Robert Moses, with little or no regard for the people who live there, even if they really cared about the people who live there, they simply cannot know, like, all the interests and desires of all the people who live, even in a town as small as Cold Spring, right? So you're not calling for that at all in your book. I want to make that really clear. It's all, but then the question is, how are you going to make this happen? And I think you're doing what is the only thing we can do, which is to simply say, look, here's what's happening. Look at it. I like it. Do you like it? If you like this, you can do it in your own town too.
Yeah. That's definitely what's been happening. I just say, look, these people did this. But, there is a moment where I don't know if it's, local government. I don't know if it's, what we call it. But there is, in Beacon right now, there's a building that's bigger than people expected it to be. And they're up in arms, they're up in arms. And they're storming the local government meetings and saying this isn't, and they said, actually, this is allowable. This is what we all okayed. A lot of people were in on this process, and you did okay this building. Now, if you don't like it and you don't think that this is the direction we should be going in, now we're hearing from you. So do we have to change this? But so at some point they are going to change their laws. I mean, this will happen at a governmental level, but it's local government and it's interactive in terms of, and if these, like what the Beacon mayor calls old timers, they're his friends. And he said,
and he's an old timer, isn't he?
Yeah, he's great. And he said, they come to me and I say, look what's happening to these buildings. They look like they used to look. Don't you like that? These new ideas and new things are coming into these old buildings, and the buildings are getting, and the town's looking the way it used to look. Is that really upsetting to you? Or is it just because it's filled with high-end bicycles? What's the anxiety here?
Right. So one way that people like me would analyze this is that it's a form of class envy. Okay, that's not, again, what I'm saying. I think I have detected a bit of that in people I've seen in Salem or know in Salem. They just don't like rich people, and they see these as rich people. And they're right. I mean, in that way, they are richer, the people who are coming in and establishing the new groovy cafe.
And capitalism is going to determine what happens.
Yeah.
So I see,
Right.
I mean,
so there's that, and that's, I just don't think, I don't really respect that in some ways. But then there's a really clear practical economic argument, which is that it is a fact that in Beacon and Salem, real estate prices and prices generally have gone way up since this process began. So I just looked, Beacon's real estate prices have more than doubled in the last 20 years. And Salem's real estate prices have increased something like 20% in the last 2 years.
Yeah, I would say doubled in the last 5 years in Beacon.
Okay. Yeah.
So, and we were talking about it, I did a book reading, and then we were talking about it, and the mayor was there, and somebody said, I said, it sounds like we're not even talking about housing. We're talking about what your downtown looks like, that the rents go up, and then you do have these sort of ridiculous stores, stores that don't sell to anybody but very high end, big wallet outside consumers. So the question is, how do we keep it livable? And somebody was saying, what if the town collectively owned some of its buildings and kept them for certain purposes? And Randy, the mayor, he straightens up and he goes, where's the money going to come for that? And he was just like, he was like, we're stuck. We can't. And it was just so, he put out his hands, which is also a beautiful thing. He didn't say, well, I'm the mayor and I have to tell you. He was like, what are we going to do about this? And so I think that's what a lot of towns are doing. It's so you start to get successful, and your storefront rented for $5,000, and that's a lot. But now suddenly it's $15,000 next month, no notice. So you have to give it over to a store that sells very high end furniture that nobody in the town can buy. Mm-hmm. That kind of specifically happened in my town. And nobody knows how to stop it because it's just the story of capitalism itself. Except that even I, as the resident of that town, I'm like, I will never find anything in that town. That'll never. I want a downtown that looks a little bit like me and my family and other people, that has a range. Right. So how do we keep the range? That's a conversation, and that will involve local government at some time, mass and scale, and maybe even content or ownership or who they cater to. That might become a local conversation that ends up in the town council.
Right.
And the ideal is that you don't have a person who's just come from his drafting board.
Exactly.
And the ideas in his little sci-fi mind
Yep.
and says, oh no, I'm Robert Moses. Let me tell you, we're going to plow this down. We're going to put a bunch of blobs here and then people are going to get to them in their spaceships.
This episode is sponsored by Renegade University. There's no question that as a culture, we have grown increasingly frank and open about sex and sexuality, but a strange thing remains. Fiction writers, especially people considered to be serious fiction writers, those people who write novels that are reviewed in the New York Times, tend not to talk about or describe in real detail actual sex. They're afraid of it. The oldest, greatest taboo in Western culture still is quite powerful, apparently, among fiction writers. But there are some writers who do it, and do it very well. They use descriptions of sex to craft some of the best short stories and novels in American literature. We're very fortunate to have one of those writers teach a course at Renegade University. Rebecca Schiff was a guest on Unregistered last year, and she'll be teaching a course, a craft seminar on writing sex. There will be 3 class meetings beginning on March 28th at 8:30 p.m. Pacific and 10:30 p.m. Eastern Time. Rebecca will show how some of the very best writers in American literature have used sex to develop characters and storylines. In the class, students will read stories that face sex head-on and explore how contemporary writers in particular use sex to create compelling fiction. Rebecca is the author of the acclaimed collection of short stories, The Bed Moved, which was a finalist for an LA Times Book Prize for First Fiction. She is considered to be one of the most honest and brave fiction writers who write directly about sex. The course is limited to 15 students, so it may sell out soon. To register for the Writing Sex Craft Seminar with Rebecca Schiff, go to thaddeusrussell.com/courses.
But in Beacon, the people said, that building's too big. And the government said, that building is perfectly legal. And you saw drafts and you saw it. If that's not what you want, we have to go back together to the drafting board.
Right.
And that will be a governmental
Oh,
moment.
sure. And so Beacon has 15,000 people living in it too.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
the local government is a pretty tiny local government. It's a pretty tiny government. We're not talking about Robert Moses here.
Then they can get kind of weird. I mean, and also
Yeah,
if they
but-
get influenced by the outside developers, they can get really
For
weird.
sure. I'm just saying that
Yeah.
the more local for government as well, the better, in my view.
Yeah,
and I think
yeah.
the more you're going to see what you want and what I want in those towns.
If people feel like they have a voice, if they're not all shuffling
Exactly.
around feeling like they're feeling demoralized. And that's the other thing that I find myself advocating based on what I saw in towns. People getting to meet each other and not falling for the idea that your neighbor is an enemy is helpful to understanding that I have a right to go to a town meeting. I have a right to ask for a permit. That's me, you know.
Yep. And the mayor of Beacon is far more accountable than a United States senator is, or the governor of New York is, right?
But he also kind of chooses
Because
to be
there's only 15,000 people in the electorate.
but the people who are also on the town council, city council, one of them's George, and he owns the bar. He owns like the
Right.
best bar in
Yeah.
town. So everybody talks to George and George listens and George watches. And Peggy just left the board, but she always went to the bar. So she was always sitting there fielding stuff. The people who are on the town council purposefully make themselves accountable to be, you're right, 15,000 is not a state senator and it's not a city. But it's still, there's a way that they've built a certain transparency in the ongoing conversation where people are finding each other and know how to shake each other by the shoulders and say, that's not what I wanted.
Sure, there are towns like that that have been ruled by corrupt thugs too, have used
Right.
the police to basically institute a reign of terror on the people. And, of course, but even there, I think those regimes locally tend not to last very long. I mean, they can.
Yeah, they can do a lot of damage.
But again, it's just
you're right.
much easier.
Yeah.
It's certainly much easier for the people to get rid of them, right? When it's that small of a town. Whereas,
I don't know, because as you and I were talking about before, if it becomes, if you live in a small town, you feel like everyone's looking in your window and you're afraid and you don't know what's going on.
Before we started taping,
Okay.
yeah, you were talking about, this is what you're referring to, right?
Well, yes, Roger Ailes lived in our town and his wife owned the local newspaper and they had a heyday going after, a small group of people who were the most civically engaged and by the end of the day, everybody was pointing fingers. People were having, illnesses. I mean, we were not well in terms of as Rabbi Brent says in Beacon, he said, the best thing is when you can meet through your differences, not despite your differences. Cold Spring got to a place where it was like, you're different and that's bad, and that's kind of what we ripped ourselves apart into. And we're a small town. And so that had everybody kind of tense and hiding, because every decision you made affected how your the school teachers, the librarians, and all of those community people felt about you and your children.
Yep.
And so the small townness was an issue. But I hear you. Small can be great if there's enough transparency there so that people can storm City Hall when the time came. And they did.
Yeah. Yeah. This is another paradox here. And I agree with everything you're saying here. So this fight with Roger Ailes, we don't have to get into the details of it, but basically what you're saying, I think, is that it ended up being this nasty fight locally in which local people, like your neighbors, hated you, and maybe you hated them, but people hated each other. And the problem is, this is the problem with the sort of scenario you're prescribing for America, is that, if we live locally like this, we can end up living right next door to our enemies. And it becomes very, very uncomfortable. So at Antioch College, kind of a classic local community, the college is sort of a prototype in a way for what we're talking about, I think. I loved it because I knew everybody, and I hated it because I knew everybody. And on top of that, you would see everybody every day. And so it was great when I was getting along with people, and it was a nightmare when I wasn't. And that's what people often say about what they love about living in New York City, is that they are always anonymous. They never have to worry about being seen by anybody.
Right.
They never have to worry about having some real conflict, interpersonal conflict, play out on the street. But in Cold Spring or Yellow Springs or Salem even, that's the potential downside. So I was going to say, but you develop a whole argument in your book about, you coined a phrase, positive proximity. And this is about really the emotional core of what you're talking about, right? Like, we've mostly been talking about places and things and businesses and cafes and stuff like that, which is all great. But you begin the book and frame it really around this concept.
Yes.
Positive proximity, which to you, and this is absolutely what I've been feeling since I moved to Salem. It's like, oh, I want to invest in this place. I love that there's a new awesome cafe downtown in Salem, but what I really love is like knowing people and having relationships, which I found out you can really have in a town like that. And so I'm deliberately cultivating it, but I'm also thinking, I've only been there 2 years, so everything's going really great because I'm super friendly and everybody's been nice to me. But like, what if I, cut somebody off in the parking lot at the grocery store and they don't like me, and it turns out they live near me and I see them on a regular basis? Or what about my buddy who's my buddy now and I see him all the time at my gym or whatever, but if we have a falling out, like, he'll be around all the time and have to deal with it constantly. Whereas when I was living in Manhattan, never worried about that.
Yeah. But it's a very, the thing is, and it's hard for me, bringing up Roger Ailes and in my town is hard because Roger Ailes created a strategy of humiliation and intimidation that visited sort of my little town. Weird, that's I'm an outlier.
And Roger Ailes very much. Roger Ailes doesn't live in every town. This is an unusual circumstance.
It's a tactic to look out for. But this is what I saw again in towns. Positive proximity is kind of what you're talking about. It's a choice to see the people around you as your potential allies to do stuff, people who are generally there for you and who will respect your privacy when you ask them to. I really think that the 21st century can have some really nice mix. There's this thing I call hometown pride and worldly welcome. So Carrboro, North Carolina will have a lot of pride in Carrboro and have signs and have the old railroad tracks and the Elizabeth Cotton Trail and all this great stuff that belongs to them and parts of the South. And at the same time, they have World's Eye Cafe. I think it's called Open Eye. And with Scott, who goes around the world bringing coffees from the world and telling and stories from the collectives he works with. And you have the art center that brings in the Tibetan monks to do the sand mandala and the African dance troupe. So first of all, you have I love where I live. This is a deep history, but there's a whole world out there, and I have these venues and conduits for bringing in the rest of the world, so I'm not this xenophobic, sort of backward person.
Right.
No one really wants to be that, I don't think. But then there's this other thing about the 21st century where a lot of people came from urban places, and they said, look, don't look in my window, okay? Don't get in a fight with me about a tree branch. Let's not get in a fight about parking spaces. If you cut me off, we'll have to talk about it, and you'll explain that you were late for a train, and I'll understand, and I'll say I've cut people off myself. The more conversations we have, the more we'll see ourselves. And ideally, what will happen is, like I never wear makeup in town. There's all these ways that I've made myself transparent. A friend of mine was saying, I'm going to have to leave town in the middle of the recession. She said, I might have to leave. We are not making it. And this other woman came up who was an acquaintance, and she said, my husband's in a fetal position on the couch right now because of what's going on. And that wasn't something that I was going to use as gossip. That was where my wheels started to turn and say, maybe we should start doing like collective dinners or something. Like, we are really suffering. How do we help each other? So our 21st century ideal is that we want to know each other. We want to, talk to each other when we walk our dogs, but we also respect each other's privacy. So I don't look in people's windows when I'm walking around downtown. And I hear weird rumors about people, and I say, live and let live, and who cares? And I there's a lot of rolling with people's weirdnesses and eccentricities and saying, well, I'm not, this is what I chose too. I chose to live in a town where I knew people hated me, that they inevitably would hate me, and they do. And then we get to meet each other, and we don't hate each other at all. But that's another story.
Yeah, no, but that is the story. That is the story. So first of all, there's the story of globalization. I think that's part of what you're talking about here, right? So one of the things I hated, and I'm sure you hated about these towns in the 80s and 90s when you and I were there touring them, was that they were terribly provincial, and they were just sort of cut off. I mean, from the rest of the world, even from the rest of their state often. They were just people who really never left the town, and they didn't know much because they couldn't. It was impossible or nearly impossible to know much or travel for them. Now, for lots of reasons, having to do with global capitalist economics, people can buy things from anywhere in the world and have them delivered to their door, and they can travel as much cheaper now. So ordinary people are flying in airplanes now, and they couldn't in the 80s and 90s. And the internet, maybe most importantly, obviously, is a portal to all the information in the world, to everyone instantly. Even if you worked in the Corning factory and, you're a 50-year-old woman and, you've never been to college, you can find out anything in the world, and they're doing it. People are doing it. So that creates also now this other beautiful thing that we're seeing in these towns. Yeah. Which is a cosmopolitanism. You can be, and it's not just the people who founded Dia Beacon, which is this famous thing that basically got Beacon going in this way, right? These fancy Manhattanites decided, we should have an awesome museum in this cool place at Beacon, and then since then, all these awesome people from Manhattan have moved there. But it's not just them; it can be anybody, and it is everybody who, not everybody, but anybody certainly can become cosmopolitan. And we just see it more, right? We see local people becoming more and more cosmopolitan.
And here's an interesting thing, too. You have people who might have made the choice to go to various urban centers who say, oh, well, I've got a computer. There's good coffee. I want to walk my dog. I want a nice library. Oh, I can go to Phoenixville, Pennsylvania. I don't have to go to Philly. I can go to any of the suburbs of around, Akron, Youngstown, Kent.
Really? Those are nice now? There's things happening?
I love them.
I haven't been there in a while. But
I love them.
Those are like the classic depressed Rust
I can go
towns.
To Cleveland instead of San Francisco. Cleveland is beautiful.
That's amazing. Really? I've never been there. That's amazing.
And it's so, but back in the day, maybe if you really, and I still advocate going to a large urban center that specializes in what you do when you're young. So, if you're a film person, go to LA. I'm sorry.
For now, at least.
New York or whatever,
Yeah.
So I will for music,
Right, sure.
But
even that's changing.
Right. the Twin Cities in Minneapolis, this lawyer, it started with donuts and coffee. He said, hey, I'm wanting to kind of be create a nexus of support and camaraderie amongst musicians. And they started the Minnesota Music Coalition. And I spoke at their conference, and the conference was local performers. There's caravans of performers that go out together. It's all genres of music. They have parties. They have the rock and roll potluck where, local musicians from the Jayhawks will bring, their favorite stroganoff, like super Midwest, but super high, the guy from Lowe brought the beer or, and so they have a coalition that I think makes being a music maker a much more stable choice than some of the major industry cities right now. So these, what we call secondary and tertiary markets, if you have a computer and you have a good airport or transportation hub, you don't have to live in the urban center or even the suburbs of it. You can live in a more tertiary place and then soak up all those history vibes and have the space and the low rent and the friendships and the grass to really stretch out and really make your dreams grow more verdantly, as they say in that whatever charitable trust on NPR, than in some of these kind of high flying, high fashion, kind of socially intimidating places. So that migration has been fantastic. And you'll get these people, like I gave birth on Cape Cod, and it was all of these Harvard doctors who couldn't stand Cambridge. They just wanted more space. They all lived on Cape Cod, and they were hilarious. Like they were kind of earthy and kind of live and let live. They weren't completely prescriptive, but they all went to Harvard. Right. They just wanted to be in a nice place. Yep. So you're seeing that migration of some of those, higher degree, PhDs type folks heading out to really interesting new places and bringing their ideas. And then you've got that permeation. Then you've got this kind of permeable surface where the town lets them fly their freak flag or whatever. And the town, that's something I call that translation. Put out the street signs, embrace your eccentrics. You know about this. Embrace the weirdos and the visionaries. Find a place for them. Listen to them. Listen to each other. Have an ethos or spaces that kind of encourage that so that you don't just feel the moral obligation. Yeah. Just have nice cafes where you spy on each other. But some of that, there's kind of a brain, the brain drain. There's kind of a brain diaspora. That's it. Going on in the country right now. And I love it.
Me too. That's it. Thank you. Amen to what you just said. That's exactly what I think's been going on.
It's been happening.
And I've sort of felt like I'm
years,
the crazy guy because everybody is talking about, oh my God, there are no creative people in Manhattan anymore. Therefore, there's no creativity in America anymore. And I'm like, wait a minute. So actually, there's a question I've been dying. This is sort of related, sort of not, but you're a great person to ask. I've been wondering how many people now make a living as musicians, just making their own versus in the 1980s, right? Before Spotify, et cetera. Do you know? Do you have any sense?
No, I only know anecdotally.
Yeah.
It's I'm really excited that Jimmy Iovine, and I always pronounce his name incorrectly, that he said, look, the streaming model is not sustainable right now. I'd like to work on it. And
for him, maybe.
Well, but he put a dog in the fight that wasn't there before by saying, because what happened was when everything started to go to the streaming model in the mid 20th century, the mid 21st, in the aughts,
right.
There was this, all of my friends and I, okay, we're creatives, and so we didn't really know what was going on. It's like suddenly I sold 100,000 albums and then I sold 50,000 albums. And I was like, oh, I guess my album sucked, right? Like that must be what's going on. And somebody said, no, there's something else happening right now. It's really kind of weedy. So the streaming model cut into some of the things that were going on at record labels. So if a record label had $20 million, they might give $1 million to 20 kids. And they're annoying kids, and they go out and they find 20 bands that might be annoying bands. And one of them is Matchbox 20. And there's like Matchbox 19 and Matchbox, and we never hear from those. But but you still had 20 bands with a little bit of money being thrown at them.
You're talking about the old model.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
And it's still, it's very feudal. It's very degrading. I mean, there's lots of problems with it. But people buy CDs. And so REM will sell a CD and the record labels will go, wait a minute, I smell money. These kids are buying, oh, wait a minute, the world wants to hear REM. And then the record company hears, oh my God, Suzanne Vega, this kid's selling these cassettes. They want acoustic music, Tracy Chapman, Indigo Girls. They want gay people. They want, so there was actually some vetting and curation going on. And when that started to fall apart, I walked into a Starbucks that used to have, try this music, listen to this music, buy this music. Nobody was buying CDs anymore. So they're like, yeah, Sheryl Crow, you loved her the first time, see her again, and just go see her in a stadium for $200 and park your car for $50 and don't bother listening to anything else. Like, just Bob Dylan, he's great. Just listen to that.
Right. We're done here.
And so this traditional bad guy of the record label, suddenly, that biodiversity that was there was some that was disappearing. Some of the enthusiasm and the vetting and the buzzing and the hyping of things was also missing, which is interesting that you'd miss it, but it was sort of, and
there is no Bruce Springsteen or Michael Jackson anymore.
So
that doesn't happen.
Right. And so, yes, that building up from the ground floor,
right.
that kind of protecting of an artist and throwing a bunch of money at him or her. My record budgets were cut down from this money to 10% of what they were.
Didn't you just leave your label?
I left my label, but I loved them so much. I was like, it's your record label and we don't sell records. But my record label head, who I had lunch with yesterday, and he's a good friend, he said, no, we could have had this conversation about streaming and about the viability of streaming and we could have done that for you. But you left and you didn't. And I was like, I just didn't see it, man. Like, I just didn't see what we could do for each other. So, and also I wanted to try the crowdsourcing model just to, as a little junior sociologist project.
Right.
It's tough. I mean, it's not sustainable. They're not doing it well enough for it to be sustainable. It's the only game in town.
Yeah.
But it's so watered down. I mean, if it's me and Roger Daltrey and Ani and and this thrash band and a bluegrass band, and we're all asking people. One magazine said, if you want to donate to Dar, and I thought, okay, we blew it. It's if you say I'm doing a pledge thing and I want you to pre-order my album, then you're selling a product. If they say, if you want to donate to Dar, then I, as a music listener, will see all of my music library as my charity, and I will donate out of my heart. People can't do that. I want to give to Doctors Without Borders.
Yeah, that doesn't work.
I don't want people to support me as a charity. So the donation idea, I'm really social. I'll have lunch with anybody. If you want to, pay to help support my album, and I'll have lunch with you, I'd be thrilled. But so that there's something there, and I love handwriting my lyrics and stuff like that was fun. But the pre-ordering the album, just there's something in it. They treated the fans like fans, and I don't know about other people, but my fans like to be called family. They don't like to be called fans. So that's kind of funky. It's a big pool that you're trying to get of support for a lot of artists that way. So the best thing you can do is either diversify your career or cross-brand yourself. So look at all these pop singers who are the hosts of shows. And my friends are like, that's because they like it. And then maybe they do, but back in the day, they didn't have to supplement their touring careers by being the hosts of shows. And they're great shows. They're very showy. They're very theatrical. I think they're having a good time. But, these are some of our biggest stars. Why aren't they just out there playing music all the time?
So I've heard people say that one of the things that's happened is that until the 1990s, that the music model in this country, at least since World War II, basically, was ginormous, 5 or 10 stars who, as you were saying, would sort of like supply all the surplus for all the little tiny bands. And the A&R guys would go sign somebody, and that's where the money came from to sign a band, local band. But that the pay at the bottom was pretty terrible. and that there was almost no middle in some ways, that it was just, so there were billionaires in the music industry, and that's what's changed. And that there are no longer any billionaires. I mean, it's difficult, right? There's no, as I was saying, there's no Michael Jackson or Springsteen or Madonna anymore. It's almost, right? There's almost no huge national, international star who's kind of the center of the music universe, who everybody's heard of. That's the thing.
Well,
there's nobody anymore.
We've got Beyonce and Lady Gaga and
yeah, but even them, I mean, like, I think there's some people who probably haven't heard of Lady Gaga, whereas everybody heard of Michael Jackson, right?
I don't know. I think that we still have superstars. We still
Sure.
have, Katy Perry, and we have, but in terms of them being as seen, and they have cultural viability. That's a larger conversation.
Yeah.
I mean, I will say this anecdotally: 40% of my income went out the door around 2007-8.
Okay.
So I had to figure out what was going to happen.
Was that? Oh, well, that's the crash. First of all, everybody's income went down 40%.
No, you're right. 2005.
Yeah.
2005, I had an album that.
And did that coincide with something going on in the economics of the industry?
Yes.
Like, was that streaming? Did streaming start then, or
Just
streaming?
about then, yes.
Okay.
Just about then, things started to break down at the record labels and stuff, and so and it took us a while to something happened, and also people were like, no, Dar, that album sucked. So I was like, oh, maybe it just sucked. I don't know, it was hard to tell, but it was happening to everybody.
Sure.
And somebody said, oh yeah, like Ben Taylor was with me on the road, and somebody said, oh yeah, that's happening to Ben's dad, and I was like, oh well, James Taylor, and I don't know if that was true or not, but somebody said everybody's feeling something happening, where this money happened and now it's just gone, and anybody can say, well, welcome to America. 40% of your income just went away. Be an American, be innovative, but it was an adjustment, and so now I'm a professor, and now I'm a writer, and all the things I wanted to do anyway, and I was always a live performer, but a friend of mine who was in a wheelchair, who depended on his record sales, just committed suicide. That's what he just pretty soon into the game, he committed suicide. So it's and there's all sorts of variables for why a person's going to commit suicide, but
that's a big one, though.
I have friends who are,
when you lose your career and your means of
I have friends who are great performers.
Living,
yeah. I'm sorry, but I have friends who are great performers. I also think they're slightly mentally ill, but they cannot get off the stage because they need to travel to get. And I'm like,
for the affirmation,
you should
for
the
money.
money.
For the money, yeah. Okay, I was going to say
no, they don't need the affirmation.
Right.
They should be in a padded cell.
What's mentally ill about them, or why is that mentally ill?
They've got stuff that's just not. They are bipolar and having a hard time with their medication system. They are getting older, and they're having a hard time, with balancing mind-body issues. They're having a hard time staying out, and it fragments you a little bit to be on the road. I think it's awesome, but it can.
Sure.
So there are friends of mine who I would love to see get off the road. They have really bad backs. They've got some issues that would probably be resolved better off the road. And I'm like, they can never get off the road. There'll be no more mailbox money, as we call it. And you can do things on Spotify for sure to work the system in a way to make it more prosperous for you. And Spotify's trying. A lot of the streaming things are listening now. And so there's no villain here, but something changed, and it's changing the way I feel like. On the one end, you used to say, this is a song I wrote from my heart and my gut, my soul. And on the other thing is, this is a song I wrote for a car commercial so that it would get on a car commercial and I could afford a tour bus. And it used to be that even if you wrote the song to sell a car, you aim to write it from your soul. I think there's sort of almost a virtue to writing a song that will get on a car commercial. Like, no one's even sort of touting the virtue of writing a song that comes out of your soul anymore. It's just sort of like, oh, that's catchy, great. Because it's so hard to sustain yourself through the music of your soul. Whereas in the 90s, that's the only thing that that gave me success.
Yeah,
all my weird outlier songs were the ones that made me popular.
Which were on labels under the old model, is what you're saying.
No, I was on an indie label. I think when you say up until the 90s. Oh yeah,
there's no streaming.
On a label. Yeah.
Yeah.
But yes, exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
Yeah, so I don't really know your industry and the economics of it. It's almost entirely anecdotal. and I see it as an outsider. But I know that in my industries, what you're saying, it's just the opposite, what's been going on. So that it was impossible for anyone to make any money doing what I'm doing 20 years ago. Mm-hmm. Someone with my training, my background, my experience to do this. I'm not getting rich on this, but there are hundreds, maybe probably thousands of people who are making some money. Some money is what I'm talking about. Podcasting, and that's just podcasting. And then YouTube, my God, it's like there are thousands and thousands of people who were absolute nobodies last year who are making a good living, just putting YouTube videos up. And that ties in to what we've been talking about, which is that it is now possible for public intellectuals to live in places like Salem, Oregon, and Akron, Ohio, easily, in fact, because for what I'm doing, it can be anywhere. And there is revenue. Now, I don't know exactly how much there is and how evenly it's distributed, but I do know there was zero revenue like that 20 years ago, that you had to live in, to be a public intellectual, you had to live in New York City, maybe Boston. That's it.
Yeah, interesting.
You had to have a PhD. You had to be a professor or have or a think tank person or something like that.
Right. So DC was an option.
If you were going to do the think tank thing, yeah. Right. It was super centralized. And if the New York Times, by the way, did not review your book, you were done. You did not have a career as a public intellectual. No one would ever hear about your ideas.
Fascinating. I hear you. And that's definitely decentralized. I mean, it's I will say this. That's not something, there's a whole layer to this that in terms of the economics of what has allowed towns and cities to rise, that I didn't even touch. And if I were to write another book, it would be actually about what we're talking about right now. And because that's what I'm noticing now, sort of what the economic layer is. What I noticed was much more this, drug deal on every corner to hometown pride evolution. And what I notice is the social side of what you're talking about, where, yes, we have these places that are permeable to, where you can be a public intellectual and thrive economically and do your thing. And then you're putting them, but you have to put them in a certain kind of town that will also allow them to have a certain kind of life that is, where they can buy a New York Times if they want.
No, that's all. I don't need to buy anything for my work. It's all through the pipes of the internet.
Well, okay, sorry, bad example. A good cup of coffee.
Oh, okay, I do need that.
Okay, so you can or something that's that feels safe, something that feels where there's a library, where that there isn't an environment of anti-intellectualism. These are important, and there's a thing that I saw, and it's basically when people, you could say there's no cause and effect here. But my experience is when people have certain individuals or groups that dig into the local food, the history, the beauty of the nature, making trails out to their waterfall or whatever their hanging rock is, into creating cultural venues, into creating certain kinds of common spaces that allow every kind of personality to either eavesdrop or participate. When towns have this going on and they dig on into these certain ways, it starts to foster a sense of place that fosters a sense of belonging, pride, and engagement. It fosters a lack of fear, a courage to engage with local government, local institutions, local leaders. And when those relationships start to build, then people start to say, and by the way, because this is my town, I care about this person who's sleeping under this bridge, and I would like to get them out from under the bridge. I care about these people who feel shut off and alienated on the edge of town. How do we enfranchise them? What kind of spaces do we need to do to help, bring our neighbors into? there is something that I saw that is a positive feedback loop of people participating in the identities and the signage and the spaces of their town that get them talking to each other, so that when, like in Rockingham, Vermont, because there was so much of that stuff going on in the downtown, a local collectively owned business that, you know, employs, I don't know, 50 people, they said, we want to go to a place not where we're going to ask the town to lie down for us. We want a town that's standing, that has all that good stuff that our employees won't, so they won't leave us.
Right.
So all I saw were places that kind of got themselves on the feet, opened up their palms, said, we are open for new ideas, open for new people. We welcome new things, and we're open for business. Mm-hmm. And it worked, but it came from kind of
choices.
Yeah, and from a kind of a pride, a faith that certain people had, and that allowed us some kind of inclusivity. But you know, it's more than just faith and choices, because I know a lot of people who are really cynical, but there are certain towns that have so much positive proximity that even the cynical, curmudgeonly jerks like are really good at making posters. Like, I'll make you a poster, and and they find a thing. Like at some point, it kind of permeates the whole organism. And so
which you call social capital.
Yes.
Or a particular kind of social capital.
And there are certain things that I think really aid the building of social capital.
Right.
Renovating old buildings and repurposing them for new things, you know.
Yeah, not the social capital the way we usually think about it, which is, you know, I am on the board of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and therefore I'm a big superstar person. You need to go through me to get anything done in this city. You're talking about just
it's
totally ordinary local individual people just doing stuff.
Grassroots social capitals. But it is just fantastic to watch, because I went to towns that were just so demoralized, and they had, you know, bad coffee specifically,
or no
right
coffee.
next to, and you know, no restaurants. And then I came back the next year, and there was like one restaurant, and they said, "Will you please go to that restaurant and hang out with people before the show, because we're trying to get people to the restaurant." And I was like, "I love you," you know. And it was next to an empty storefront, and a storefront where they're still selling washing machines.
Yep.
I'm like, good luck with that, you know. And so, but then the next year I come, and the washing machine store is also doing some higher tech stuff. So they're still selling washing machines, but they're also, you know, like, I got to watch these public spaces appear out of, you know, the crazy woman with like the messy bun creating repurposing an old dry cleaner to become a concert venue. Like, it started there.
Yep.
And then she met this guy, and this guy, you know, wanted to start a local gallery next door, and that kept people in town. And then there's a hotel, and then there's, you know, grass and flowers and dog walkers.
Yeah, you also talk about bars as being important. I love that.
I'm a big
like
good bar is
you're not
great
apologetic.
bar.
It's just like, yeah, bars are great, and they're
Jane
important.
Jacobs, big bar advocate.
That's right.
Bars, well, a certain kind of bar, but again, it's got to have there's the bars that you go to forget yourself, and bars where you go to remember yourself, you know. And the black hole in the wall bar that's lit by a neon sign, those could be awesome, but usually they're just there for you to just
the American alcoholic bar is what I call them.
Yeah, the day drinker bar, you know. And it's sad, and a lot of times they're fronts for, you know, organized crime, and like there's just a lot of, you feel it. It's like a dark closet. Yeah. But
I know very well. Yeah. I've written the history of that. Yeah.
Oh, of course.
Yeah. It's okay.
and interesting things can come out of that. So I'm sorry.
No, it's all fine. No, absolutely. I agree with you.
But in terms of
it's a mix.
Public spaces.
The mafia has given us good things and really bad things.
Well, it's
right.
One of the things. There's a city that I talk about where they apparently just tore up a whole bunch of highway to reveal the river underneath, and then they have river celebrations and everything. Apparently, that's because phone calls were made and arrangements were made to happen quickly and with no friction. That road just came up, and that was a.
Well, you know, the mafia established the first gay bars in this country. So the Stone.
Okay, that makes sense.
Like
yes,
the Stonewall Inn,
for
for instance, but all the gay bars in New York City were owned by the mob.
But that was also a rough hang. I have to say.
Yeah, but
So,
but they protected the patrons from the cops.
Oh, okay.
That was where they had a deal with the cops. They basically
Right.
paid off the cops to not raid those bars. So the mob-owned bars were the safest places to go. So
There
but then
we
again,
go.
but then again, they would kneecap people and kill them too. You know, it's a
See?
mix. I'm agreeing with you.
Exactly. So, but the, if we're just talking
but as
about
I-
sort of something that creates that kind of swirling mist in the air of stuff, a good bar would be a bar that has a little bit of lighting so that you can see people.
Right.
That's not pretentious. That's not too expensive, but that also has expensive kind of local brew kind of things. And
I'm thinking
the mix and match.
Does this make sense? This phrase, local nexus. Is that what we're
Yeah.
talking about?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
And it's there's a little magic in it. It's who owns it, it's who works at it, it's what they serve, it's
course.
what they look like. And when you have that, I write about a bar in the book called Dogwood, and George was a sculptor, and he created the bar as his social sculpture. It's like he created the sculpture. It's like a coral reef upon which the community could build, not so pretentious that all of the local, construction workers, and he also worked construction, he knew them, and the electricians and people who are really tired could come in and get a cheap beer before they went home. They sit next to some of the goat-bearded kids who want to drink a craft beer and have more disposable income because they don't have kids and they don't have, He created a space where everybody would feel welcome. There's modern art, there's hanging plants, there's Guinness signs, there's a really nice staff, and there's a real mix of prices. And at the end of the night, because they're the last bar open, if you're really hungry, they'll sell you a bologna sandwich in a plastic bag. So he even cares about us stragglers.
Yeah, that requires him caring and making those choices.
That's the thing.
And again, we agree on this. And this, I love that actually that is all you're saying in a sense. It's like, it's up to you. You got to do this.
Yeah.
So we can have the most beautifully organized economy with all sorts of new freedoms. And so I could live in Salem and never leave my house and never spend $1 in that town.
Yeah.
I could do all of my commerce online. I could bring in all of my information online. I can do my podcast in my house, but I'm simply choosing for my own reasons.
Right. I see what you're saying about choices.
To try to build something in that place and to care, because I want to care about a place for the first time in my life. I never have before really cared about a place like that. So that's it. I mean, we could have this economy, the wonders of the internet and globalization could have us all living in our little boxes and never seeing each other. But it just turns out, apparently, that there are a lot of people out there who are more like Dar Williams and just for whatever reason care about this stuff. Because there's been a lot of musicians who have toured the country. You're not the only one. It's just that you seem to be the only one, or one of the few at least. For whatever reason, you just care about these things and you're making particular choices.
Okay, but here's the funny thing. I am not. All my musician friends talk the same way I do. I just wrote this book, but it is like they actually, and also, I mean, I take it as a compliment that I do care. I care deeply, and I cared enough to come up with these sort of categories and to kind of open myself up for the criticism that I'm just telling people to gentrify and whatever, like I like to address it because I think it's a good question, and I'm glad to have. I feel like my book was like a flag, that people can say, well, what about gentrification? And say, what's the difference between gentrification and improvement? Right. Between livability and inaffordability. Like, let's find those lines. Let's try to heal this one because an improved town, a safe town, a dog walking town, a pedestrian town, these are creating some new American ideal communities, where it's not, where there's that middle place. So I was happy to do this, but my musician friends, they talk about, vibe and food. They need music stores, bookstores, their need for inspiration and desire to get to know people. My friend Ellis Paul is constantly blogging about these new cities that he finds, and friends with the Milk Carton Kids, they're always talking about like the cool stuff that they've found in places, and not just to kind of suck off of it, but to support it. Yeah. Like they want to put good blood into the streets and support local
and
commerce.
Encourage it.
Yeah.
So, okay, here you go, Spike Lee. Here's what I would suggest you say to him when you have your town hall meeting with Spike Lee about gentrification. So in Manhattan and San Francisco, gentrification is absolutely what has been happening over the last 30 years. And that is why I can't afford to live there. Most creative people can't afford to live there. That is just true. Those places are now full of super rich people. That is gentrification definitionally. Now, what I had been hearing, and we still mostly hear, is that, oh, well, that's the end of it. And I thought, well, wait a minute. Did all the artists and musicians and intellectuals just die? No, it turns out, and this is why your book is so important. It turns out, because you show this, it turns out that those people just went to other places. They went to other places and they made new Manhattans, new Lower East Sides, new Haight-Ashburys. They're smaller. They're maybe in Indiana or they may be in Oregon, but that's where it's at. The counterculture, alternative cultures, the avant-garde, new thinkers, free thinkers, people like you are just operating in different locations.
Oh, yeah.
So change, is kind of inevitable, but we should just embrace that and just think, okay, so Beacon, if it's now unaffordable for working class people, that sucks. That's just bad for them. But there's going to be another Beacon then, because those people go elsewhere. At least that's what's been happening.
And Beacon is trying to, Beacon, a lot of places would love to be the best of both worlds because they see things as cautionary tales. So they're saying, oh gosh, how do we keep the thing that's special and cool and allows in all this cultural vibrancy and still have affordability? Like, how can we thread the needle? Can we thread the needle? Like, people really, and they haven't yet. So I would love to be, I would love to be at the table, at any kind of dinner party talking about it because we're not there yet. So you get cool. And then, if I'm 75 years old and I grew up in a place, I don't want to move to 3 towns over, even though that is available. Right. And literally in Beacon, there are 3 towns over, you're fine. You just go to Wappingers right now. Right. But Wappingers is going to happen, as it were. And so then so there is this kind of like, let's have the positive proximity that also says, what are the 5 things that make things available for retired citizens? What are the 5 things that make this a livable place for?
And we care because we are going to be retired citizens.
Yes. And also because they are our town. And also, like, towns with no old people in them are weird. Chappaqua, at a certain point, didn't have a lot of senior citizens in it. Like, there was just a lot of people moved when it got really fast. And when I went to Middletown, I was like, a lot of people are like limping and they're like having a really hard time getting along. And my mom was freaked out and she said, Dar, they're old. And I mean, I'm not, it makes me sound like a declawed cat, like, I'm so precious. But you want older citizens. They hold your history. They do all of the volunteering. They're great babysitters. They hold the history. I mean, they are so valuable. So,
right, they're not just hustling like the rest of us.
No, the magic is in how we can hold on to some of that affordability. However, that said, these places, I mean, I tell everybody to go to Gainesville, Florida. Poor Gainesville.
It's amazing.
I tell everybody to go to Gainesville. And Tampa St. Pete is awesome.
I've heard.
And I think Jacksonville, everything I've seen in Jacksonville, I love. So, all these places in Florida, West Palm Beach, my friends are there. There's all sorts of places, like, no one's looking, just go.
Phoenixville, Pennsylvania is one of your
I
towns
feel really bad for them because I love them so much that I fear I'm going to make them horribly popular. But Phoenixville, Bethlehem, Allentown, Doylestown.
Those are like the icons of the Rust Belt. No, Bethlehem, Pennsylvania.
Exactly.
Is like,
I know.
That's supposed to be hell on earth. You're saying something's going on in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania?
It is. And I don't know if it's happened yet, but they're going to have a Museum of Industrial History, but it's going to be in the old, the old, whatever, there's the smelting, what are they called?
The steel town.
The huge places that made the Golden Gate Bridge. Yeah. There's a place that's across from them, so they're giant and ominous. There's a performing space apart from them that's done everything right. There's the Martin Room, Martin Guitars. There's the Yinling Room for Yinling beer. Right. The room that I played in is like orange, and I said, what's this color? And they said, this is the color of the Golden Gate Bridge. They have a TV station right next door, so it's a big complex. There's a place for large concerts and festivals. So they've created this modular art space for every kind of size of band.
And those people used to live in New York City, probably, or somewhere like that, right?
You should live. No, usually
they got priced out. They got priced out of.
You got to live in Bethlehem,
Brownstone, Brooklyn, and now they live in Bethlehem, PA.
Bethleham's fantastic.
That's right.
And there's all these places, all the places around the Triangle cities of North Carolina. I think North Carolina is about to go blue as a state because it's just really attracting a certain kind of retiree and a certain kind of agenda, social agenda.
Let me finish with this. There's another thing you and I have in common, which is a very weird thing. It is that you and I identify as straight. You're thinking, where is he going with this? And we, in our work, have, I don't know what you would say, but we have, I don't know if I identified with gays and lesbians, but we have certainly both been very positive and very celebratory, I think, of gay and lesbian culture. At least that's true for me. And I think it's sort of true for you. I know that, you've been considered, that's one of the things.
An ally.
In your career. Yeah, I don't like that word. I hate that word.
That's what I've been called.
I actually despise that word.
All right.
No, I just happen to love sort of traditional gay culture, in this country, and where you can identify it.
Me too.
Less now that it's now looking more like Walmart and less like a local town. But in other words, it's less distinctive. There's been a lot of assimilation going on, right? Which is a big debate. But anyway, historically, what's been called gay culture in this country is I just like it. I just see a lot of freedom of expression, a lot of mobility. Right?
Yep.
Because if you know anything about gay people, many of them have to choose their own family. They have to choose their own home, essentially, because they're often cast out. And many just do anyway. They just choose to establish a friendship network that becomes almost like a family. So that, to me, also is kind of what we're talking about here. Because if you have more than 2 cities or 3 cities where you can go as a gay person, as a countercultural rebel, as an intellectual, as a folk musician, whatever it is, something weird and outside the mainstream. If you have more than those 2 cities, we just have much more freedom to do our thing instead of just having to live in the goddamn tenements in the Lower East Side for 10 years. I used to say, I did my time in New York.
Yeah. That's so. Okay, well, Richard Florida talks about the things that attract what he calls the creative class. So that was his expression. Tech, talent, and what he calls tolerance. And tech is, tech aptitudes, and talent means sort of, what we're talking about different, people who might have an advanced degree or might have a specialty that traditionally would lead them to a big city and try to kind of climb this very high ladder. And now they get to kind of climb the ladders that they climb in, towns that allow talent to want to stay, are great for, creating this new economy, this new creative economy. And then the third one he says is tolerance. And you're touching on some of the things that he talked about in terms of there are certain kinds of minds that allow for certain kinds of new ideas and a certain kind of cultural mobility.
Yep.
And for me, I was surrounded by radical feminists at Wesleyan. And what I realized is that I am deeply interested in gender freedom. And I think I'm also really interested, I'm really not speaking for myself, but I'm really into sexual freedom. So
Good.
Yeah.
You don't hear that too often these days.
No, so
unfortunately.
but there's a kind of a, well, but sexual freedom means, power with and alongside, not power over, unless that's chosen and that whole thing. But, I'm just really interested in a lot of mobility. I like the word mobility, and that's because I think that's what I love so much. There are these women I lived around in Northampton who she was like building a house. She's hammering away, she's sawing, and she's beautiful, very dykey, very, kind of very attractive to me because I'm straight and just like she's just.
I know exactly what you mean.
So she's just lovely, and she's talking about how somebody said to her, well, if you do this. If you're a carpenter, you're never going to get a man. And she's talking to her friend and they're like, huh. And so there's this great moment where women were like, I want to be a car mechanic. I'll never get a man. I don't want a man. And so there was this kind of way that they opened the world up for themselves. But then there were certain institutions in place, like the Michigan Women's Music Festival, that said, let's really embrace and celebrate these what we might call alternate styles of living as dominant styles of living. Let's walk hand in hand down these streets in Indiana. And they created a sense of like, why not this as opposed to that? Why not subvert the paradigm? So even the bravery, not the bravery, but even the assertiveness of it was inspiring to me as a woman. So that's all sort of gender stuff.
Yep.
And men saying, there's a poster that says, thank you to those women who were, allowed themselves to be more aggressive. That allowed me to be more gentle. To those women who, who took this kind of job, that allowed, who took a job on this corporate board, that allowed me to nurture children, stay home and nurture children. Every choice that you made that was against these rigid gender things allowed me to make a choice against my rigid stereotype as a man. And that's what I loved, watching men stepping into a diversity of choices about their identity, parallel to women asserting that they were allowed to do the same. Watching all that sort of cauldron of, and then watching partners show up, male and female, but like so much androgyny, so much, mixing and matching of different things that weren't based on their traditional genders was also exciting to me because those partnerships seem to have a lot of equality. And as a feminist, it's really great to see, men and women having these dynamic relationships that don't involve, after a time, a woman sort of getting assigned to a role and a man getting assigned to a role that neither of them want. So yes, I would say gay culture, but I would say gender pioneers.
Yes.
That was always where the power was. And I think wars will not be fought because I think people allowing themselves to explore their aggressive and non-aggressive sides without fear and coming out of the closet if needs be, or not even, or exploring it as a straight person will allow us so much more personal freedom that we won't feel as much need, in my experience, to dominate others, to somehow degrade a part of ourselves.
So I have been really despairing about feminism, the state of feminism. That, what you just said, gives me hope again. I mean, that is, to me, the greatest. Especially what you said about its effects on men.
Yeah.
Right? Because like to sit the way I'm sitting right now, it could be what a fag does, right? It used to be what a fag does. But I always thought, feminists just allow me the freedom to do this. And the queers and the fags are the ones who actually allow me to do this. It did. And I just stopped feeling that. I stopped feeling that feminists and people like you in your world were interested, like in my freedom. Mm-hmm. And I was saying, they're the model. They're the pioneers for my freedom.
Right.
And that's what you're saying. And I just, God, amen. I don't know what else to say, but thank you.
Oh, that's great. I there's a lot, we can intimidate each other in this world, but with all of this change, but I hope that I speak for a lot of women because to me, it's exciting to look at my field. Like I had a lot of power. Feminists helped me come to the table and that's all I want for everybody. Yeah.
Crying in public. That's what fags do too, by the way. So thank you for giving me the freedom to do that too. But this all links back to sexual mobility, gender mobility, geographical mobility.
Well, there's Richard. Yeah, I'm sorry.
No, I was just going to say, so, and this has to be the last question. and hopefully it doesn't start a new argument or an argument. REM's song is, what is it? Stand in the place where you live. And I think you have an epigraph at the beginning of your book that's somewhat similar. Now that could be taken as an injunction to stay where you are. And that's not what we're talking about, right? I mean, I hope we, okay, good. I want to make sure this. Because I was pissed off at REM. I was a huge REM fan until that song. And I thought, what do you mean? What if you happen to live in a place you hate? What if you're born into a family that hates you because you're gay or you're different or you're whatever? You should be able to leave. Okay, good. So
no, I don't. I don't know Michael Stipe, but I would. My experience of that is like whenever people want to move someplace, I'm like, okay, first of all, warm, cold. Can you deal with winter? Can you deal with summer? Like, I like to be this little human computer. And, so my experience is figure out what you feel, and follow a friend of mine in my town had a dream about my town. And then he came and he's like, oh, and he follows that. He's like, oh, here it is. Like literally moved to our town because he saw it in a dream. So absolutely.
And you want to create more places to go to.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Okay, good.
Oh, yeah.
I thought so. I just wanted to make sure.
Oh, yeah. No.
Not. Okay, good. Because there is a sort of there's an ecological thing. There's part of the ecological environmentalist movement that says basically that we should stay where we are. Which I find to be.
It's not that. Well, okay. Here's what I would say. You're going to be better for the environment if you like where you live. Because you're not going to want to leave as often.
Mm-hmm. That's just right. That's a fact.
And when I live in a pedestrian town. I'm surrounded by people who know like many layers of me. So I feel like any weekend I could stay home and be really happy and meet a lot of people that I love. I could stay in place. I also walk to a train and the train takes me to New York City, one of the big, a metropolis of a world city. So I can do that. Where I live is not very fossil fuel intensive because I chose where I live. I say, follow that thing, follow the voices of wherever you go. But then if you're in the outskirts of Atlanta and there's a giant magnolia tree out your window, that's like the symbol of so much. And it inspires your imagination because that magnolia tree is not the tree that you're going to see when you look out the window in Bemidji, Minnesota. Like, feel it, feel that humidity, see that weird lizard walking across your porch, listen to that music and say, how do I relate to this music? Eat those tacos, just like allow yourself to experience the best of where you live and get excited about it and see where you stand in proximity. I have friends from New York and they move south and now they have cowboy boots. I'm like, look at you. And they're like, I know. And like they allowed themselves to feel that new thing come into them and influence them just as they brought their new thing there. They stood where they lived in that way as opposed to, I think it's just kind of a Smell the Roses song. And I'm a Smell the Roses person. I certainly believe that it's really exciting. When people change their name and stuff, and I'm always into it. Change their hair, change their wardrobe. I love experimentation.
Change their address.
Yeah. So geographical exploration is. I love that you went to Salem. I love that you see something there that you can be a pioneer and explorer with, but there's enough there that you are already happy to be there. These are the things, yes. And what I'm seeing in the United States are more places. Richard Florida says, here's an index called the Gay Index. Here's an index called the Bohemian Index. Generally, where you find a lot of bohemians or a lot of gay people, you're going to find a lot of mobility and excitement and stuff to do and a good economy. And my joke is that I have a book that hopefully will help teach people how to be more gay and more bohemian.
Amen.
Wherever, all over the place, all over the United States.
Well, Dar, you give me hope.
You give me hope.
In more ways than one. And I really appreciate this.
Thank you. All right.
Wow. This was the Unregistered podcast, and I'm Thaddeus Russell. To sign up for the Renegade University webinars, visit thaddeusrussell.com/courses. To support the show and become a member of the Unregistered community, go to unregisteredlisteners.com. Thanks for listening.